At one point in my life, I worked at a ground border checkpoint in Canada. One afternoon, a compact car with US plates rolled up, and the driver, a guy who looked maybe mid-30s, confidently handed over his driver's license, like that was the end of the conversation. I asked him for his passport. He frowned, clearly caught off guard, and said something along the lines of, "For what? I'm not leaving the continent. I'm just going into Canada. That's not really another country." I calmly tried to explain that, yes, Canada is a separate nation with its own borders and rules. That's when he got irritated. He pointed out that Canada sits directly above the US on the map and argued that crossing a line on land shouldn't require international documents. According to him, North America was basically one big zone, and an American license ought to be enough. In the end, we denied him entry. He stood there for several minutes insisting that we were trampling on his constitutional rights and that Americans shouldn't be treated like foreigners anywhere on the continent. That wasn't even the first time I'd heard something like that. Years earlier, my family had hosted a teenage exchange student from a small town in the US. One evening, while watching the news, a story about Australia's Prime Minister came on. He turned to my father, genuinely puzzled, and asked why another country had its own leader if the US president was supposed to be in charge of everyone. We spent the better part of an hour trying to explain that political authority doesn't magically extend past national borders. He honestly believed other countries were more like oversized states, with their leaders answering back to Washington. Later on, while I was working behind the counter at a small cafe in Vienna, an American couple walked in. When I took their order in English, the man smiled proudly at his wife and said, "See? I told you they all learn our language for visitors." Then he asked me what language we spoke when tourists weren't around, something he called Austrian. I had to explain politely that the language here is German. He laughed it off, saying that made no sense because Germany was a completely different country, and that Austria should really have invented its own language. And if that sounds strange, it still doesn't top what happened later while I was working at a hotel in Paris. An American guest called the front desk in a panic because her power adapter didn't fit the outlet. When I explained that France uses a different electrical system, she interrupted me, annoyed, and said that electricity was invented in the US, so American plugs were the correct ones. She went on to argue that using anything else was inefficient, bad for business, and that a city like Paris should have upgraded to the American standard by now. She then demanded that we rewire her room immediately. A while later, I joined a guided walk through the ruins of the Roman Forum. One man from the US in our group kept interrupting the guide with questions that made the rest of us exchange uncomfortable looks. At one point, he gestured at the crumbling columns and said, genuinely disappointed, "It's impressive and all, but why did they leave everything unfinished? Didn't people back then know how to complete buildings properly?" The guide, an Italian historian who clearly had nerves of steel, explained that these structures were ancient and had deteriorated over centuries. The man shook his head, leaned toward his teenage son, and quietly remarked that this was exactly what happens when construction isn't done to modern American standards. According to him, the whole place was basically a lost cause. Around the same time, a close friend of mine was working as a flight attendant. During a long-haul flight to Sydney, right in the middle of December, an American passenger waved her over, looking concerned. He pointed at the screen showing the flight map and said, "There's a mistake. It says it's summer in Australia right now, but it's December. December is winter." She explained that Australia is in the southern hemisphere, where the seasons are reversed. He wasn't convinced. For several minutes, he argued that winter happens everywhere at the same time, and finally concluded that either the airline or the map system was lying, and he was fairly sure it wasn't him. Later on, when I was managing a small bookstore in London, an American student approached the counter holding a copy of 1984. He asked, completely straight-faced, whether the book was written in English. I told him it was. After all, George Orwell was British. He hesitated and followed up with, "Right, but is it American English?" He explained that he didn't want to deal with unfamiliar words like lorry or flat, and asked if we had a version that had been properly translated for American readers. He was entirely serious about needing an English-to-English translation. And then there was the time I met an American couple while hiking in the Swiss Alps. They were stunned by the landscape and kept taking photos. After a moment, the woman turned to me and asked who actually owned the mountains, whether they belonged to a corporation or some private group. when I explained that they were natural features, part of the country itself. She nodded thoughtfully and asked one last thing. Who was responsible for turning the waterfalls on each morning? She seemed genuinely impressed by how precise that job must be. She followed up by asking whether the waterfalls were shut off at night to conserve water. I just stood there for a second, trying to figure out how to explain that waterfalls don't run on schedules or switches. Not long after that, I overheard a conversation at a currency exchange counter in Tokyo. An American traveler stepped up and said he needed local cash. The clerk asked how many US dollars he wanted to convert into yen. The tourist paused and asked why the currency was even called yen. Why not just the Japanese dollar? According to him, that would make things far easier for everyone. He didn't stop there. He complained that the exchange rate made no sense either. $1, he argued, should always equal 1 unit of whatever currency was being used. Anything else was unnecessarily complicated and should probably be fixed. The clerk smiled politely the entire time, though his expression suggested he was questioning his life choices. Later, while I was working at a tech support center, I received a call from an American man who was upset that his brand new laptop wouldn't connect to the internet while he was vacationing in Italy. After walking through a few basic steps, I realized he was trying to connect to his home Wi-Fi network, the one still running in his house back in Arizona. When I explained that wireless networks have a limited range, he lost his patience. He argued that it was called the World Wide Web, so it should work everywhere on the planet. According to him, selling Wi-Fi that didn't cover the entire world sounded like deceptive marketing. Another time, while working in a pub in Dublin, an American tourist walked in and loudly ordered a drink using a name that carries very dark historical weight here. My manager, a large man with remarkable restraint, calmly explained that we don't use that term and offered to make the same drink without calling it that. The tourist dismissed him, saying people here were far too sensitive and that history shouldn't affect what drinks are called. A few moments later, he was asked to leave. And finally, when I was assisting a world geography class at a US university, a student raised her hand during a lesson on Africa. She asked whether Africa was a country or a continent, explaining that she kept hearing individual country names but also heard people refer to Africa as if it were one place. When I told her it was a continent made up of more than 50 countries, she looked genuinely stunned and said that information should really be promoted better. She shrugged and added that all of this was incredibly confusing for Americans. I was reminded of that while visiting the Louvre, where I watched an American family stop in front of the Mona Lisa. The father leaned forward, squinting, and said he didn't understand why people made such a big deal out of such a small painting. His teenage daughter chimed in, saying the woman didn't even look happy enough and seemed bored. If she were posing for a portrait, she said, she would at least try to look cheerful. According to them, the painting had no real personality. They snapped a quick selfie, then walked off, complaining that the museum was enormous and strangely lacking escalators. Another time, I had to explain to an American coworker that England and the United Kingdom were not interchangeable terms. He was planning a road trip and casually mentioned driving across England, starting in London, then heading north to Edinburgh, and finishing in Belfast. When I pointed out that his plan involved traveling through 3 separate countries, he dismissed it. They were all on the same island, he said, and they all had the same monarch, so calling it anything other than England felt unnecessary. He accused me of overcomplicating things with technicalities. Back in my hometown of Florence, an American tourist stopped me on the street to ask where he could find the best deep dish pizza. I explained that this style came from the US, specifically Chicago, and that Italian pizza followed a very different tradition. He looked genuinely let down and said it was strange that the country that invented pizza didn't offer what he considered the ultimate version. To him, it felt like Italy had simply stopped improving it. Before walking away, he asked if there was a Domino's nearby. On a boat tour through Ha Long Bay in Vietnam, I overheard an American woman speaking to our guide. She admired the scenery but said the area felt underdeveloped. In the US, she explained, they would have built a luxury resort by now, complete with golf courses and water parks. From her perspective, the region was wasting an incredible business opportunity and should think more seriously about commercialization. The guide, whose family had lived there for generations, responded with nothing more than a quiet, tired smile. My cousin later married an American and relocated to Texas. When we visited, her husband took us to a shooting range and began explaining gun culture. With complete sincerity, he said firearms were necessary because the United States was the only country that was truly free. In his view, Europeans had surrendered their weapons and were now controlled by their governments, while Americans kept guns to prevent tyranny. He couldn't understand how we felt perfectly free without owning an entire personal arsenal. At another point, I worked at a hotel in Iceland during the winter months. While working the front desk at a hotel in Iceland one winter, an American guest stormed up to me around 11 in the morning, clearly irritated. He complained that the sun still hadn't come up and asked whether something was wrong with it that day. I had to explain the concept of polar night and how, because of the Earth's tilt, daylight barely appears that far north during winter. He narrowed his eyes and said that didn't sound believable. According to him, the sun rises at the same time everywhere, every day, and he suspected the government was covering something up. Another American I met while backpacking was absolutely convinced that soccer was a relatively new sport that only existed because of U.S. influence. He proudly explained that Americans had been playing it in schools for years, and that, thanks to their professional league, the rest of the world was finally catching on. He even suggested people should be grateful that the U.S. was turning it into a global phenomenon. The Brazilians and Germans he was talking to just stared at him in silence. On a train ride from Brussels to Amsterdam, the American sitting next to me studied a map for a while before turning to me. He said it felt strange how close European countries were to one another. Back home, he explained, you could drive all day and still be in the same state, but here a short trip meant crossing several borders. He asked whether that made people nervous and wondered how anyone avoided accidentally ending up in another country. It sounded stressful to him. At the Acropolis in Athens, I heard an American tourist ask the guide whether famous ancient thinkers like Socrates and Plato actually spoke Greek. When the guide confirmed that they did, the tourist followed up by asking how they managed to write anything down if the Greek alphabet was only used for fraternities, things like alpha and beta for college parties. The guide paused for a long moment before beginning his explanation. I once had an American customer in my cheese shop in Switzerland who asked to sample Gruyere. After tasting it, he frowned and said it didn't resemble the Swiss cheese he bought back home. There were no holes, and he questioned whether it was even authentic. He suspected Switzerland kept inferior cheese for locals while exporting the real version to the US. No matter how I tried to explain it, he wasn't convinced. My university roommate from California once picked up a globe in our dorm room and spun it slowly. When he stopped it over Russia, his eyes widened. He said he had never realized how massive the country was and wondered why anyone needed that much land. It struck him as greedy. He then suggested it would be fair for the United States to take some of it, just to balance things out.